Welcome to Mr. Kelin Stories. I'm so glad you're here. Before we dive into today's story, I just want to take a moment to say, may peace, joy, and blessings be with you every step of the way. Now, get ready for an incredible journey. Today's story will take you through unexpected twists, heartwarming moments, and a powerful lesson that will leave you thinking long after it ends. It's about a millionaire, a beautiful wife, a dazzling mistress, and a night that changes everything. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. If you're excited to hear the full story, make sure to hit that like button, comment your thoughts below, and of course, subscribe so you never miss another amazing story. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's get started. Grab some popcorn and enjoy the ride. George Anderson was living a life many people could only dream of. As one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, his name was often featured in magazines, praised for his ingenuity and sharp instincts. His mansion was a sprawling estate with perfectly manicured gardens and a swimming pool that glistened under the sun. Every room was adorned with expensive furniture and rare art pieces from around the world. But in all this luxury, George's heart felt an emptiness he couldn't quite explain. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. His life, his business, and his beautiful wife, Clara. She was everything George could have asked for in a wife. Clara was gentle, patient, and deeply loving, with an unpretentious grace that made people feel at ease. Yet, to George, it wasn't enough. There was something about Clara's simple, quiet nature that made him uncomfortable in the fast-paced, image-obsessed world he had created for himself. Clara wasn't flashy. She didn't wear the latest designer clothes or speak in the way society expected a woman in her position to. She didn't join him at every high society gathering, preferring instead the warmth of their home. Clara's beauty was understated, and her humility seemed almost out of place among the glamorous women George was used to seeing at events. But it wasn't just her modesty. It was the way people, his friends and colleagues, reacted to her that made George uneasy. Her soft-spoken nature often caused uncomfortable silences at parties, as if she was invisible. George knew the whispers, the looks, the judgment. He heard his friends' comments behind closed doors. "She's so plain. Doesn't she know how to dress up?" Or, "She's not as cultured as the others." The whispers stung George deeply. He wanted more. He wanted the approval of his wealthy circle. He wanted to be admired and respected, but Clara, despite her intelligence and grace, seemed like an obstacle to that. He would never say it out loud, but deep down George started to feel ashamed. When they went to parties, he would find himself quietly wishing she would stay home. It wasn't that he didn't love her. He did, deeply. But the pressure to fit in with the rich and famous was suffocating. And Clara didn't fit into that world the way he thought she should. He began to resent the very qualities that made Clara so special. Her quiet wisdom, her ability to make anyone feel comfortable, became a reminder of his own insecurities. Instead of cherishing the love she gave him, George found himself wishing she could be more like the women his friends adored, beautiful, fashionable, and charming, in ways that would make people admire him. There was a growing distance between them, though neither of them spoke about it. Clara, always kind and never critical, had no idea what George was going through. She couldn't understand why he seemed to grow more distant, why his eyes would sometimes wander when they were at events. She only knew that she loved him deeply and would do anything to make him happy, even if it meant staying out of the spotlight he thrived in. But for George, the more he tried to hide his discomfort with Clara's unassuming nature, the more he felt trapped. His world, built on success, appearance, and approval, was starting to feel suffocating. And in his desperate need for validation, George made a choice that would set everything into motion. He needed someone who could fit the mold of the life he thought he wanted, someone who could make him proud in the eyes of others. As Clara continued to support him, unaware of the storm brewing inside him, George began to drift further from her, increasingly focused on finding a way out of his emotional prison. But it wasn't until he met Laura that things would begin to unravel, and his life would change forever. George Anderson had always been a man driven by status. He lived for the moments of admiration, the looks of envy from his peers, and the sense of power that came with being a prominent figure in society. But there was a hole in his life that he couldn't fill with wealth, and he believed that the missing piece was something more, someone more, perfectly aligned with the world he had built around him. And that person came in the form of Laura. Laura was everything Clara was not, at least in George's eyes. While Clara had a quiet elegance, Laura was loud, bold, and unapologetically glamorous. The moment George met her, he knew she was the type of woman who could make a statement wherever she went. Her style was impeccable, always the latest fashion, her outfits bold but refined, her presence magnetic. She was the kind of woman who could turn heads with a single glance, and that was exactly what George was craving. She didn't just wear clothes, she wore confidence, radiating an energy that seemed to draw everyone around her into her orbit. Unlike Clara, who preferred staying in the background, Laura reveled in the spotlight. At events, she knew how to command attention with her laughter, her sharp wit, and her unrelenting charm. She could talk to anyone, from the richest moguls to the most influential celebrities, and somehow make them feel as if they were the most important person in the room. Laura knew how to navigate the social scene with ease, and that was something George had always longed for. George found himself entranced by her. His heart raced when he was around her, feeling that rush of excitement he had missed for so long. She had a way of making him feel important in a way Clara never did. There was no hesitation in Laura's voice, no awkward silences. She was a firecracker, unafraid to speak her mind, and George loved it. When he stood next to her, he felt like he was finally a part of the world he had always wanted to be in, the world of glamour, prestige, and power. At parties, George was no longer just another successful businessman. With Laura by his side, he felt like he had become someone extraordinary. They would enter the room together, heads turning, eyes widening. The rich and famous couldn't get enough of her, and through her, George was basking in their attention. People admired him for the woman he had on his arm, the kind of woman that made him look powerful, desirable, and most importantly, respected. Laura was a symbol of everything George had wanted to achieve, the perfect image of wealth, beauty, and charm. The shift was noticeable. Clara, with her quiet demeanor, had never given George the same sense of power at these events. He had often felt embarrassed by her inability to blend in, to make conversation with the right people. She was always polite, always respectful, but she wasn't the life of the party. And in the world George was trying to climb higher in, that was a flaw. He didn't want to be the man who was overshadowed by his wife's humbleness. He wanted to be the man everyone was talking about, the one who had it all. And with Laura, he felt like he finally had it. But there was a dark side to this newfound happiness. George kept his life with Clara a secret from Laura. No one knew about his wife, not Laura, not his business partners, and not even his closest friends. The very idea of the two women meeting terrified him. The truth was, Laura was everything he wanted to flaunt, and Clara was the person he had to hide away. Every time George looked at Laura, he was reminded of everything he had been missing in his life. She was the image of perfection in a world built on appearances, and Clara, with her simplicity, was nothing like that. In his mind, Laura was a symbol of success, of fitting in with the crowd, of having everything everyone else envied. Clara was the woman who loved him unconditionally, but didn't fit the mold of the world he was trying so hard to impress. George had no plans to ever tell Laura about Clara. In fact, he kept his marriage to Clara hidden with great care, always making sure to avoid conversations about his personal life. When people asked about his significant other, George would deftly change the subject, skillfully redirecting their attention to his latest business ventures or accomplishments. To him, Clara was something to be tucked away, an embarrassing reminder of the life he had left behind. The thought of Clara and Laura meeting was an unbearable one. The two women represented two completely different worlds, one that George had built on appearances, and one that had loved him deeply without ever asking for anything in return. Clara didn't belong in the world of high society, and in George's mind, Laura was everything he needed to maintain his position. He couldn't risk having them in the same room. George continued to live in his lie, convinced that by keeping his two worlds separate, he could have the best of both. He would have Laura to present to the world, the perfect image of success, and he would have Clara at home, the wife who never asked for anything more than his love and attention. But deep down, a part of George knew this wasn't sustainable. He could feel the cracks beginning to form in the walls he had so carefully built. Every time he looked at Clara, the guilt gnawed at him, and every time he saw Laura, the emptiness he felt in his marriage became even more apparent. George had no idea how long he could keep up the charade, but for now, the life he had with Laura was everything he thought he wanted. She was the perfect partner for the life he had created, a life of luxury, admiration, and respect. But what he didn't know was that his world was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The invitation arrived on a bright Monday morning, delivered in a sleek, embossed envelope that promised an evening of opulence. It was from one of the wealthiest families in town, an event that was already the talk of the city. The gala, they said, would be the most glamorous of the year. The mere thought of being invited was an honor that many would envy. For George Anderson, it was the perfect opportunity to show off his new life. His life with Laura, the woman he had always dreamed of, the woman who could help him gain the kind of attention and respect that he craved. George's excitement was palpable as he immediately accepted the invitation. He meticulously prepared for the event, carefully selecting the most extravagant tuxedo in his wardrobe, jet black, with a sharp, tailored fit that he knew would make him stand out among the other guests. It wasn't just the tuxedo. He knew that everything had to be perfect. His appearance, his demeanor, and most importantly, the woman by his side. Laura would be the jewel of the night, the one who would steal the spotlight and make George the envy of everyone around them. In the days leading up to the event, George couldn't help but imagine the looks on the faces of the other guests when he walked in with Laura. She was stunning, always so confident, so effortless in her beauty and grace. She would be the perfect arm candy, the woman everyone would want to know. With Laura on his arm, he felt invincible, like he was finally living the life he had always wanted. But as the night of the party approached, a different reality began to set in. Clara, ever gentle, ever kind, had overheard him talking about the gala. She had quietly expressed her excitement at the prospect of accompanying him, hinting that it might be nice to attend together as a couple. George's heart sank at the thought. Clara, with her soft, unassuming nature, didn't belong in this world. She was never one to shine in the spotlight. Her modesty was a trait he had once admired but now found so out of place in his life. The idea of bringing Clara to the party, the one place where George intended to show off his perfect life, was a thought he simply couldn't bear. Clara's presence would be a reminder of everything he had outgrown, a stark contrast to the glamorous world he wanted to immerse himself in. She wasn't the kind of woman people would fawn over. She was quiet, humble, and utterly unaware of the superficiality George was chasing. He couldn't let her ruin this moment. Not tonight. In a moment of selfishness, George crafted a lie. He told Clara that he would be attending the gala alone, as he had an important business matter to discuss with some associates. Clara, ever trusting and patient, didn't question him. She smiled softly and wished him a good time, unaware of the storm raging inside him. But as the words left George's mouth, he felt a pang of guilt. The lie stung, a bitter reminder of how far he had drifted from the woman who had loved him unconditionally. Still, he convinced himself that it was for the best. He was finally going to have a night where he could truly be himself, without the weight of his wife's modesty dragging him down. The night of the party arrived, and George was nothing short of thrilled. He stepped out of his mansion with Laura by his side, her beauty more dazzling than ever. She wore a dress that shimmered under the light, a deep emerald green that highlighted the smoothness of her skin and the sparkle in her eyes. Her presence commanded attention. George couldn't help but feel proud as they entered the grand venue, the mansion of the wealthy family hosting the event. The glittering chandeliers above, the laughter echoing through the hall, the clink of champagne glasses. It was everything George had imagined. He walked into the room with a sense of power, the center of everyone's attention. As they entered, the crowd paused, eyes flicking toward them. Whispers spread like wildfire. The other guests watched as George and Laura made their way to the bar, exchanging pleasantries with a few acquaintances along the way. Laura's laughter rang out like music, and George stood tall, his chest puffed with pride. This was the life he had always dreamed of, the respect, the admiration, the feeling of being in the company of the right people. As the evening unfolded, the party grew more extravagant, more indulgent. People danced, glasses were raised in toasts, and the air was thick with excitement. George felt like he was finally living in the world he had always been meant for, a world where success was measured in appearances and connections. He and Laura shared whispered conversations, stealing glances at one another, exchanging knowing smiles that made George feel on top of the world. He was the man with the beautiful woman, the one everyone envied, the one everyone wanted to be. But as the night continued, something strange began to happen. There was a feeling in the air that George couldn't shake. It was subtle at first, a strange unease that made him pause and look around the room. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something felt off. It was as if the atmosphere had shifted, and not in a way he could control. The more he tried to immerse himself in the grandeur of the event, the more distant he felt from it. The laughter seemed hollow, the conversations more shallow than they had seemed at first. And then it happened. George turned, expecting to see Laura still by his side, laughing with some guests. But instead his eyes locked onto a familiar face across the room. His heart skipped a beat. It was Clara. How was this possible? Clara stood near the edge of the crowd, a soft smile on her lips as she conversed with several guests. She looked radiant. Her hair was styled more elegantly than George had ever seen it before, her dress simple yet striking. It wasn't anything extravagant like the others, but the way she carried herself, her grace, her poise, it made her the center of attention without even trying. She wasn't flaunting her beauty like Laura did, but there was something about her presence that drew people in. George's stomach twisted. How had Clara gotten here? And why hadn't he known she was invited? More than that, why did she seem to be doing so well without him by her side? As Clara spoke to the guests, George watched in awe. They were laughing, engaged, hanging on every word she said. Clara, the woman he had so often dismissed, was now the one in control, the one who commanded attention without even trying. The realization hit George like a ton of bricks. He had been wrong. It wasn't the superficial connections and glamorous appearances that mattered. It was the kindness, the authenticity, the presence Clara brought into a room. His mind raced. What was happening? Why did Clara seem so at ease, while he was beginning to feel like an outsider in a world that had once felt like his own? The night had already begun to take a strange turn for George. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest when he first saw Clara across the room. Every time he tried to immerse himself back into the festivities with Laura by his side, his eyes would drift back to his wife, standing in the midst of a lively crowd, her presence shining in a way he hadn't imagined possible. The more he watched her, the more unsettled he became. It wasn't just the fact that Clara had made her way into the heart of the event. It was that she seemed completely at ease, drawing people to her in a way George had never expected. As he and Laura mingled, his gaze inadvertently kept falling on Clara, who was now surrounded by some of the most influential figures at the gala. There she was, in the center of attention, not in the background as he had imagined, not shrinking from the crowd, but truly thriving. It wasn't the lavish dress, the diamonds, or the makeup that made Clara stand out. It was something far deeper. It was her warmth, her genuine kindness, her authenticity. These were qualities that George had long overlooked in his pursuit of appearances and acceptance in the world of high society. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. Clara was standing there, in a simple but elegant dress, surrounded by people who were hanging on to every word she said, captivated by her warmth, her laughter. It was as if she had become the very life of the party, exactly the opposite of what George had imagined she would be. The truth was, Clara wasn't just blending into the background. She was the one they all wanted to talk to, the one they wanted to know. The realization hit George like a heavy wave. Clara had something Laura could never have, something that had always been there but that George had been too blind to see. He looked at Laura for a moment, her beauty, her outward perfection, and then back to Clara. He had always thought he needed someone like Laura, someone who could make him feel powerful in front of others, someone who would turn heads and command respect. But as he watched Clara in the center of the crowd, surrounded by people who seemed to genuinely admire her for who she was, something in George began to shift. His feet carried him toward Clara, though with each step a sense of dread filled his chest. How could he explain this? How could he explain the lie he had told, the betrayal of both his wife and his mistress? But Clara, as always, greeted him with an open, trusting smile, oblivious to the storm inside him. "George," Clara called out warmly, as if nothing was wrong. Her voice was full of joy, her eyes bright as they met his. "I'm so glad you could make it. This is such a wonderful event." Her words struck George like a punch to the gut. How could she be so calm, so unassuming while he was trapped in this web of lies he had spun around himself? How could she be so generous with her love when he had been so selfish, so caught up in the pursuit of external validation? Clara was everything he needed, but he hadn't seen it. Not until now. Before he could respond, Clara turned to the people surrounding her, eager to introduce her husband. "This is my husband, George," she said proudly, her voice full of affection as she gestured toward him. "Isn't he handsome? He's such an incredible man. You all should meet him." Her words sent a chill down George's spine. There it was, the moment of truth. Clara was proud of him. She had no idea what he had been hiding, no idea that he had brought his mistress to the same party, that he had lied to her face. And yet she stood there with nothing but love and admiration for him. She believed in him. She believed in their marriage. And in that instant, George realized how much he had taken her for granted. The people around Clara seemed genuinely impressed by her presence, not because of her status or her wealth, but because of who she was, kind, gracious, and deeply genuine. They listened to her with respect, laughed at her jokes, and seemed charmed by her spirit. George could see the way they leaned in to hear her stories, the way they hung on to her every word. They were drawn to her authenticity, her ability to make them feel valued, seen. In that moment, George understood something that had eluded him for years. Clara's worth was never in the clothes she wore or the world she inhabited. It was in her soul, in the way she made others feel like they mattered, in the quiet dignity she carried with her every day. The contrast between Laura and Clara was stark. Laura, with all her beauty and confidence, seemed shallow in comparison. Her presence demanded attention, but it was the kind of attention that George had been chasing all along, the kind that came from appearances, from how others viewed them, from the image they projected to the world. But Clara had something real, something deep. Her beauty was not in her looks, but in the way she made people feel. She had a warmth that radiated from within, and it was this warmth that had captivated the people around her. As Clara introduced George to the crowd, he stood there, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing moment. He was torn between two worlds, one that had promised him the admiration he so desperately craved, and the other that had always offered him the love he didn't deserve. He couldn't help but compare the scene unfolding in front of him to his own life with Laura. Where Laura commanded attention with her beauty, Clara simply commanded respect. Where Laura dazzled with her appearance, Clara illuminated the room with her kindness. George stood there, unable to say a word, feeling the weight of his choices crash down on him. The people around Clara were speaking to her with reverence, admiration, and appreciation. But with Laura, the room felt empty. The smiles didn't seem genuine. The conversations felt like performances. And for the first time, George understood what he had been chasing, what he had thought he needed. Wasn't real. It wasn't enough. Clara, with all her grace and authenticity, had become the heart of the party. She didn't need extravagant jewelry, a perfectly polished appearance, or designer gowns. She had a beauty that no one could replicate, a beauty that came from within, one that had nothing to do with the world George had so desperately tried to fit into. And in that moment, as George stood at the crossroads of his life, he finally realized he had been blind to the things that truly mattered. As the night wore on, George's world seemed to turn upside down. The moment of clarity he had been waiting for, the moment that had been brewing in the back of his mind throughout the evening, had finally arrived. He couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of regret that gripped him as he watched Clara, the woman he had once thought was too simple, too reserved to fit into his world, now glowing with a kind of radiance that outshone anything Laura, or anyone else at the party, could have ever offered. Clara wasn't just standing in the background anymore. She was alive in a way George had never seen. Her laughter, infectious and genuine, echoed through the room, drawing people to her. She was so present, so engaged in the conversations she had with everyone. It wasn't the surface-level interactions of wealth and status. It was real. Clara was giving of herself, her warmth, her kindness, her unwavering authenticity. People were magnetized by her, captivated not by her outward beauty, but by the beauty of her soul. She had a gift, a rare one, the kind that didn't rely on the opinions or validations of others. She made people feel seen. George had always viewed Clara's simplicity as something to hide, as something to be ashamed of in his high society circles. But now he saw her for what she truly was, a gem, rare, unpolished, and glowing with an inner light that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He realized that in his selfish pursuit of acceptance and admiration, he had missed the most important thing in his life. Clara wasn't just his wife. She was his rock, his anchor, the person who had always been by his side, quietly supporting him while he chased after shallow goals. As he watched her from across the room, George felt a wave of guilt crash over him. He had spent so many years chasing validation from people who didn't care about him. And yet here was Clara, a woman who had given him everything without asking for anything in return. She had loved him deeply, even when he had failed to truly see her. And now, in this room full of laughter, champagne, and pretension, Clara's beauty, the beauty that George had once dismissed, was undeniable. Finally, unable to contain the storm of emotions inside him any longer, George knew what he had to do. He excused himself from the guests around him, his footsteps heavy with regret. He couldn't let this night end without making things right. He needed to talk to Clara, to apologize for the selfishness, the lies, the judgment that had clouded his heart for so long. He found her standing near the edge of the room, chatting with a few people, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. But when she saw George approach, her face softened, and she excused herself from the conversation. She turned to him with a warm smile, the same smile she had given him all those years ago when they first met, the kind of smile that made his heart feel like it could beat again. "Clara," he began, his voice faltering, his heart weighed down by the heaviness of his own guilt. I need to apologize. I've been so selfish, so focused on appearances and what other people think. I've been ashamed of you, of our life together, and I let that cloud my judgment." Clara's face remained calm, her gaze understanding and patient. She listened to him with the same grace she always had, never interrupting, never judging. It was as though she had known this moment would come, that one day George would see the truth. "I was wrong," George continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight, seeing you here, seeing how everyone is drawn to you, not because of your clothes or your status, but because of who you are, because of your heart, I realize how wrong I've been. You're everything I've ever needed, and I've taken you for granted. I've been so blind, Clara. I can't even believe it." Clara's eyes softened, her expression never changing. She had always known. George had never once questioned the love she had for him, nor the love she had for the life they had built together. She had always accepted him, flaws and all, and it was this unconditional love that had sustained her through the hardest of times. "George," she said quietly, her voice soothing and full of warmth, "I've always known who you are inside. I've always loved you for the man you are, not for what others see on the outside, but true beauty. It isn't about fitting in or impressing others. It's about being real, being kind, and staying true to ourselves." The words hit George like a revelation. It was so simple, so clear, yet he had spent his entire life trying to impress others, trying to create an image of perfection. But Clara had shown him the truth without even trying. She was a reflection of everything he had been searching for, and yet he had overlooked her in pursuit of the wrong things. Tears welled up in George's eyes as he realized the depth of his mistakes. He had hurt the one person who had always loved him unconditionally, and it had taken him all these years to understand that the only thing that truly mattered was the love they shared. The world's approval, the admiration of strangers, the fancy parties, none of it could compare to the connection he had with Clara. She had always been enough, more than enough. Without thinking, George reached for Clara's hand, holding it tightly in his own. The connection between them was so strong in that moment, so undeniable, that George felt a peace settle over him, something he hadn't felt in years. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I will never be ashamed of you again. You are my heart, my home. I've been foolish, but I will make it right. I will cherish you from now on, the way you deserve to be." Clara's smile was gentle, yet full of wisdom. "I've always believed in us, George, and I always will. You just have to believe in yourself, in who you are with me, not in who you think you need to be." A weight that had been pressing on George's chest all night lifted in that moment. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, he saw her with clear eyes. This was the woman he had always needed. He just hadn't known it until now. As the night came to a close, George didn't leave the party with Laura on his arm. He didn't care about appearances or what anyone else thought anymore. He walked out of the mansion, hand in hand with Clara, the woman who had been by his side all along. The air was cool, but it felt different now, lighter. The noise of the party faded behind them, and George finally felt at peace. In that moment, he knew the truth. True wealth wasn't about money, power, or status. It was about love, acceptance, and the ability to embrace the beauty that lay within. And George had finally found that beauty. not in the world around him, but in the woman beside him, the woman who had always been enough.